Good morning, everyone. My name is Teresa Gimenez, and I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm going to present a case study today with my colleague, Monica Velasco Gonzalez. The title of her presentation is Cultural Learning as a Process in the Museum, a Case Study. Exactly what we want to talk about today is we want to talk about how to transform a traditional cultural lesson on the use of coca leaf in the Andean communities into a transformative intercultural experience that challenges or changes the perceptions of drug use in the West. The reason why we decided to do this is because we are believers and we think that we have to change or transform our teaching practices. Nowadays, still, even though there's a lot of awareness of the importance of integrating an intercultural perspective into our practices and into language learning, the reality still is that the dominant approach to culture is very static, and it consists of basically factual, teaching facts about products, food, traditions, holidays, history, geography, and that in any way is transformative. This is a very static approach to culture, as opposed to an intercultural approach, which seeks to decenter the learner, and it also seeks to challenge and transform the learner's identity, values, beliefs, worldview. So, although it sounds like, yes, I think we all agree that an intercultural approach is what we should integrate in our language classrooms. The reality is that it's not easy to link language, culture, learning, and intercultural perspective. In our case, which is we are both teaching Spanish in higher education at University of Pennsylvania. It's in a required course and in the isolation of the classroom. We don't teach culture, or we're not learning language immersed in the culture. So those are our main challenges that make it really difficult. Let's talk about the first one, which is the teacher's lack of training. It is a reality, there's a lack of training. There are studies that show that teachers do want to integrate an intercultural perspective. The problem is that they don't know how. They are afraid of stereotyping, and they would love it. They would love it, but they don't know how to do it in a systemic way. The resource that the teachers have, the main resource, is the textbook. Nonetheless, is a particular case in Spanish. The textbook still follows the dominant approach to culture, which is very factual. And in the case of Spanish, it's even counterproductive because it reinforces stereotypes. In the case of Spanish, we find that our textbooks are very reductionist. So Spanish-speaking countries, we're all the same in one. On the other hand, we have the challenge of the attitudes of the students. First of all, this is a required course. So the students are not necessarily motivated. Second one is that students in our particular university are very professional oriented. So they just wanted to learn the language, and so they can use it as a tool, right? So they're not necessarily so interested in the culture. And then on top of that, we have the environment. We are teaching language and culture in isolation, in the isolation of the classroom. We are not in contact with the culture. So we don't give up, and we still want to transform our teaching practices. We want to overcome these main challenges. We want to do something that is experiential, engaging, and transformational. And we want to develop the learner's intercultural competence. When I talk about intercultural competence, I don't want to go deep into this, but I do want to mention it because we're going to talk about the case study, and at the end of it, we will see how transformation happens based on these 5 dimensions. So we're talking about the Byron model, and first one is knowledge. Then we have 4 skills, which is the intercultural attitudes. We want to change. We want We don't want to change. We want to touch upon the students' attitudes. Skills of discovery and interactions, critical cultural awareness. We transform their critical cultural awareness, and skills of interpreting and relating. So, of course, we think that object-based learning goes very well. It's going to help us. It helps us in our objective because it builds on the natural curiosity of people. It is experiential and active learning by nature, and encourages critical observation, formulates learning tasks, and develops active inquiry. In addition, object-based learning activates the learning processes of intercultural learning, which, according to LiDi are noticing, comparing, reflecting, and interacting. These processes don't have to happen in this order or at the same time, but these are the processes that object-based learning is activating. So I'm going to talk about now we're going to talk about the case, and I'm just going to talk about what we have, or what we have and how we flipped it into an intercultural experience. So what we had was in our course is at the end of the semester, and the last unit is on drug use and legalization of drugs. The textbook is providing us with two things. One thing is an audio that talks about the difference between coca and cocaine, which we found interesting. And then it gives us a reading on violence in Latin America, a very reductionist reading, and that totally reinforces stereotypes. The audio, we like the angle because the students are going to learn something that they don't know about, like what is coca and the difference between coca and cocaine. But again, if we just leave it there, if we just talk about the differences, we are, again, going to fall into the same pattern of teaching culture as facts and stay with the dominant approach. Now, we're going to talk about what we did to transform this learning and provide the students with a transformational intercultural experience.
So, we decided to put into practice these intercultural competence and object-based learning approaches by designing an intermediate Spanish lesson for college-level students at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. The objectives of the class were that students would compare the sacred, medicinal, and social use of the coca leaf in Andean indigenous communities with the stigmatized perception of drugs in Western culture. By doing this, the students would decenter, relativize, and mediate between the two cultures. How do we do it? Well, we started by having the students learn about the social, medicinal, and sacred uses of the coca leaf, and by learning about the process by which cocaine was created in the Western world. How did we do it? In the process of doing this, the students learned about the negative impact of drug abuse in Western countries. So the negative impact that abusing drugs in Western countries has in indigenous communities. And one of them was the stigmatization of coca use in indigenous communities. They also reflect upon the concept of drug and the cultural differences regarding its use in different parts. And by doing all this, they mediate between Western and Indian culture. So they notice differences, they empathize, they relativize, and they reflect upon things, and they mediate between the two cultures. How do we do this? So the verification process began with reading, so more learning. We gave the students 2 readings. One which talks about what Coca is and its medical, commercial, sacred, and social uses. These readings we developed ourselves. And the other one talks about cocaine. So the Coca to cocaine process, and also the impact of cocaine use in indigenous communities. So how using cocaine in the Western world impacts the indigenous communities. And the impact is huge because there's a social impact, an economic impact that is really important because all the stigmatization of drug use in the Western has forced a lot of indigenous communities to stop growing coca leaves, which is really, and coca is really intertwined in their societies. Economically, because they're not able to find other crops that are as cost efficient as coca is, but also medical, and for the environment, it's really important because because of the drug use abuse in here, or in other Western countries, there have been a lot of fumigations in their communities, and those fumigations with like chemical products have affected their health and also the environment in their communities. So there's a lot of consequences to that. Then we have the museum visit, okay, which is where they actually mediate because they get in touch with the objects for the first time. And here we have the objects. This is how the class starts. The students come into the room and they come into contact with these objects that are displayed, like we have these objects here. You can see that some of them are artifacts, some of them are pictures. I will explain some of the artifacts. We have the aguayo, which is the textile. Over here, over there. That is really significant because that aguayo is a textile piece that they use to transport coca, but they use it to cover from the cold. They use it to transport other stuff. They use it to perform ritual ceremonies, divinatory rituals, social contracts, economic contracts, to buy and sell, to engage a wedding, okay? Another one that I think is really significant is the chuspa. This is chuspa, and this is archaeological. A chuspa is a bag that they use to transport coca, and it's something that they have for their whole lives, and they carry with them for their whole lives. And you can see how this is important because we have an effigy here, that one, which is also archaeological, even from before the Incas. And you can't see it in this picture, but in the back of the effigy, you can see that woman is a woman. She's carrying a chuspa. You can see the chuspa in her back. But you can also see that we included some pictures, like this one, and I think this one is really significant too because it represents a kintu, which is like an exchange. It's a social contract, an exchange of some kind. And you can see that it's being done with coca leaves over an aguayo. Okay, so we can see the objects at use. So the students come into the classroom and they're asked to circulate around the objects, have a look at them, try to guess what they are, what they were used for, what they are used for in the present, trying to describe them, okay? Then we keep working with the objects and we keep scaffolding because the objective of this whole lesson is for the students to come up with their own exhibition. So we keep going with the scaffolding, and then we give them this activity in which we chose, to us, the most significant artifacts from the ones that the students could see, and we had some definitions or its uses, and they had to do a matching activity. This is before the students could actually hear the explanation, the actual explanation of each object.
Then we had a presentation from an expert. He was great. He was an expert in the use of plants through history. And he was also from Colombia, so it was great, you know, in every way.
Just when you walk away, the people can't hear you on the live stream. So
oh, you cannot hear me?
on the live stream, so
okay.
if you want to look, you can use that.
Okay.
So the presentation that he gave touched on like several issues. The first one was Coca, where it's grown, what it is. He gave like a description of the plant, different parts of the plant, different like components, where it's grown, past and present uses, medical uses. He talked about a case study that was really interesting because it's a case study about a mummy of a girl that was found on the border between Chile and Argentina, and it illustrates how important Coca was for their society and is for their society. Okay, we're not going to go into the case study, but it was really interesting. You could see how important it was because they found the mummy with Coca in her mouth still. Then he explains, he talks about the interaction of the Spaniards when they, well, the Conquistadors, when they came to America and they got in contact with products that were new to them. One of them was Coca, but they also had tomato, cocoa, Latin cocha, that's like a medicinal plant, and other things. And the Spaniards decided to adopt their use, but they never wanted to adopt the use of Coca. So here we like pause the presentation and we ask the students to reflect upon why. Why do you think the Spaniards adopted the use of other products that they found that were new to them, but they did not adopt Coca? Some of them come up with the answer. The answer is because the conquistadors realized that Coca was so important for their religion, for the indigenous people's religion, that they did not want to have any contact with it because their goal was to convert them into Catholicism. So they didn't want to use Coca because for them it was their religion and not their religion that they wanted to impose on the indigenous communities. So then he talked about the development of cocaine in Europe, how it was developed in Europe and not over there, where Coca comes from. And then we come to the end, where we ask the students to like put all this together and come up with an activity. So we ask the students to choose 3 objects from the objects that they had seen at the museum and to pretend that they had to put up an exhibition with those objects. And we asked them to give it a name and justify their selection of the objects, keeping in mind the mission of the museum, which is the Pen Museum transforms understanding of the human experience. Okay, so that way they had to relativize, mediate, evaluate all they had learned, all they had seen. I was going to say all they could touch, but they couldn't really touch things at the museum. That was the big, assessment that we had. And we also had an essay in the exam, okay, in which we asked them, a question to reflect upon the whole experience. It was really important to us to know if this was really a transforming experience for them. So we gave them this reflection activity with 4 questions. We didn't include the 4 questions here. We included only 2 of them because we think these are the 2 more relevant ones. And that was how you see Coca use through my eyes before visit and after visit. And we chose several comments, and I think Teresa is going to comment on this, but she's going to give you some handouts with them. I can say that they were really interesting. How do I go? Okay, so some of these are really interesting because you see that the students really changed their view of Coca completely. Some of them were like even deeper and talked about how, they talked more about their like social view changed. But Teresa is going to talk about this.
Okay. So we choose 4 comments. The last comment on your handout is not. The last comment is not on your handout, or you have a different one, but we decided at the last minute to change it. So here we're gonna, the first example, it says, through my eyes, before the visit, I wasn't sure about, what did I know about Coca? What did I think about Coca? He's not sure. But then after the visit, it says, here we see, it is similar to how Christians use wine and bread during communion. This way, we also consume objects that make us feel closer to God. In many ways, people and their practices are the same, even if we don't realize it. So we can get a lot out of this comment. To me, what I see is definitely a transformation. This student is actually comparing, mediating. No? He actually has found a beautiful example. He's comparing Christians and the use of wine and bread. He's also saying, decentering and seeing culture as something very relative. So it says, in many ways, people and their practices are the same, even if we don't realize it. So I think this is a very, I find it really interesting and really transformative. It's very obvious shows in a very obvious way different kinds of transformations. And then I have another one here, the first one. This one, I think it emphasizes how through the objects, the power of the objects, right? Before the visit, he says, I wasn't sure how influential Coca was for the Incans. I assume it had the same level of importance as tobacco or other allowed substances in the US. And then he says, I'm amazed at how much a plant can shape a culture, influencing rituals, daily routines, community interactions, and even art. Seeing all the artifacts, so this I highlighted because of that, so that you can see the power of the objects. Seeing all the artifacts and how Coca was connected to all of them made me realize how integral Coca was for the Incans. Students, not in these reflections, but in their own presentations, they were talking about the sophistication of the objects and how through the weaving of the textile, they could see how important it was, and they were comparing it with, the elaboration of the artifacts make them reflect on how important and integral Coca was for the Incans. Then we have, okay, here's another comment. It says, before the visit, I didn't know how much about the use of Coca, so I didn't have strong opinions. However, I probably aligned with the Western norm of fear of the uncertain. After the visit, I learned to look at things with different frames and contexts. So he's definitely changing his worldview, or is becoming aware of his own perspective, that he has his own perspective. I understood how deeply rooted Coca was in Incan culture. There was a lesson to be learned about judging other cultures within their own context. So he's obviously becoming aware that he's becoming aware of himself or his own assumptions, his own judgments. I'm not exactly sure. He's also referring to, in general, how in general, how we judge other cultures, and we shouldn't until we shouldn't trust our assumptions or our beliefs or assumptions about other cultures unless we know more about them. Then the last comment, which you don't have in your handout, but I have it here. Well, this is basically another one. Before the visit, I was unaware of the importance of coca leaves in Incan society or even in South America. And after having the opportunity to personally explore ancient Incan artifacts, I began to better understand the importance of the plant in Incan society. Again, this is another example of the power of the artifacts, how the artifacts are transforming and transformative for the learning, and transformative in the way we see things, beliefs, attitudes, knowledge. I mean, there's a lot going on here, and this is the only. I mean, this is what they wrote down, but that doesn't mean that there's more to it. The thing is that some of the things they don't know, or they didn't even write them down. But I'm pretty sure there is there's a lot more information or more transformation that they did not express. But to me, the transformation is obvious, and I just want to talk about a little bit more. This is not reflections, but this is feedback that we got from the students. So we run a survey, and in the survey we had 122 responses, because it's a big course. And I would come back to the museum to tour the exhibits. Almost 80% strongly agree or agree. That's big. I mean, that's a high number. 13, almost 14 are neutral, and only 8% of 122 are disagree. Then we had, I would recommend this activity for future students in Spanish 140. We have the same, around the same numbers. Almost 80 agree, 13 are neutral, and 8 are disagree. And this is the one that I really like, is I am more interested in learning about the cultures of the Hispanic-speaking world after the museum visit. And the numbers are a little lower, but still they're pretty good. I mean, almost 70% agrees, and I'm sorry, 60%, and 31 is neutral, and the rest disagree. It's a high number. And then I would come back to the museum to tour the exhibits. Roughly 70%, 80% agrees, 13% is neutral, and 8% disagrees, out of 122. And then we did get good feedback. The students were asking to spend more time with the objects. I think this is very good feedback, and we're looking into ways of let them spend more time with the objects. And also, they want more physical interaction with the objects. This is a challenge that we have. Anne and I have discussed this. How can they have more physical interaction? How can we can make it so they can touch the objects they can? We are, in a archaeological. I mean, some of them are archaeological objects. So, we're gonna
make some reproductions.
Yeah, I think the solution is to have the objects and reproductions, so that they can touch them. Thank you.